in observance of Veterans Day, we are going to have the medley of the songs played, and as I call out the medley or the song as she's playing it, if you are a veteran or a widow of a veteran, please stand. Well, wait. She's Thank you. Army, please stand. Navy. Air Force. Marines. Thank you all. Now, our first hymn today is America the Beautiful, and it is on page 630. Please stand.
As Sean had stated prior, due to the sensitive nature of today's sermon, I thought it best that maybe we ask our older kids if they wanted to do something a little different today. And so at this time, if you are outside the normal age range for children's church, the 8 to 12, 13 age group, now would be the time to head out with Mr. Sean and enjoy some Bible trivia today. Before I get started, I do want to just add a little bit to the meeting that we're going to have Tuesday. Tuesday, if you have told me that you are going with us to Canton first week of December, try to be at this meeting. If you can't make it, I understand, but kind of let me know. So again, these are for the ones that have already said that they are going. This is not an interest meeting. This is a planning meeting for the group that will be going to the mountains in December. But like I said, there are certain subjects in the Bible that tend to be a little bit harder to preach than others. But let us consider what Paul says here, 2 Timothy 3:16. He tells us all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. So my prayer today is that this message in particular is profitable to instruct us to be more righteous as it pertains to meaningful marriages. So what that means to me, again, being that there are certain topics in the Bible that are harder to preach than others, and this one being particularly sensitive due to the nature of what Paul is addressing, I do feel that every word of the Bible is needed. If it wasn't needed, we wouldn't have it. And so again, this is not the best topic to cover with small children around, because it'll have more questions than answers if the little ones are here. But for the adults, this is something the adults definitely need to hear, because we all need to be mindful of marriage and what it means to us personally, and what it even means, and we'll get to this a little bit later, for those who maybe aren't married or have never been married. And so Paul covers a lot here in this message in chapter 7. But what I want this to do, I want this to strengthen marriages in the church. And I have preached on marriage at least 2, 3, 4 times since I've been here, because marriage means a lot to me. I think highly of marriage. And I think that's the problem with the world that we live in, is that people don't take marriage seriously the way that they should. Half of all marriages end in divorce. And to me, that is a staggering number. That half of all people don't consider the holiness of marriage as they should. And so that's what I want us to look at today, is keeping marriage holy and keeping our marriages vibrant within our homes. Something to consider too, that the instruction that we are receiving today comes from Paul, who himself was an unmarried man. And he teaches us about keeping these marriage vows and keeping couples together for the greater good of God's people. Consider this too, also, that Jesus was an unmarried man. And Jesus felt very highly of marriage and keeping marriage vows and keeping strong relationships. And so the next few chapters of this that we're going to look at, and I think my mic just died. The next few chapters that we're going to look at, Paul will be addressing more life principles, and marriage being one of those. And some of these are going to be what I like to call agree to disagree topics. And you'll have that. Some things that, because of how we interpret the Bible, how it's translated, we may not always agree to what the meaning is. Now, one thing we need to understand, that with everything in the Bible, there is only one meaning. There's only one intended meaning. We have to figure out what that is. And so we tend to disagree. But again, I want you to consider what we look at today, that 2 Timothy 3:16 tells us very seriously that all Scripture is profitable. And so we should at least consider that as we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So let's get right into it. And our first topic here is marital relations. So follow me if you will. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Let us pray. Our Father and our God, we come to you today thankful and grateful, Lord, for this time to be in your house and to study your word and to learn from your word. Lord, I pray that your people will absorb the things that are spoken here today, Lord, and that we'll use it again to edify and to strengthen the marriage that they have, Lord. And even for those of us who are not married, Lord, I just pray that this message also speaks to him. Your word covers a multitude of things that we need to know and to learn from you, Lord. So, God, I just pray for this message, and that, again, it will strengthen your people to hear what you have to say, and strengthen marriages, and strengthen our resolve, Lord. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So, the first thing that we see here, Paul is addressing a particular concern that has been given to him. Again, the Corinthians had written a letter that we don't have that addressed certain questions when it concerned the teachings that Paul had given them while he was with them. And so maybe there's some things that Paul maybe didn't cover in depth. Maybe there were some things that he covered that needed a little bit of clarification. And so Paul is taking this time to address these things that they had questions about, and address other things which precipitated the need for this letter in the beginning. But he doesn't want them to miss the mark about the teachings that he had. It's funny that he follows up what we've just looked at the last couple of weeks with chapter 5 and chapter 6 when he talks about the sexual immorality that has defiled the church and has defiled the people. And he goes into the things which don't defile. The same act, but going in two different directions. So again, last week, the week before, we've looked at this defiling of one another through sexual acts. And so with anything, like with politics, with anything else we see two polar opposite ends of the spectrum a lot of times. If you go hard left, somebody's going to go hard right. That's just how we do as a people. And so we had this group of people that were defiling themselves with such sexual immorality, just absolutely disgusting things that they were doing. And then we get this group of people that has gone far to the right and say, no sex of any kind for any reason. Not even if you're married, no sex ever again. And Paul's like, no. That's not what I said. That's not what I meant. And they're getting this because they see Paul's life. And Paul, again, having never been married, has never had sex, has never had relations with a woman. And so they say, well, okay, Paul, this is how Paul lives his life. This is the way Paul teaches. This is what we're supposed to do. And Paul says, it is a gift. It is a giftedness to be as I am. He says, but that's not what God has intended for everyone to be. Again, he has told them in his prior time with them that it is good for a man not to touch a woman. It is a good thing. It's also a good thing to be married. It's also a good thing to have relations with your spouse, with your wife, with your husband. Paul, again, preaching about himself, preaching Jesus, again, being celibate and being unmarried. He wants them to know that it's not wrong to have sex. It's just wrong to have sex in ways that God has not ordained. How else are we going to have children? How else do we consummate our marriages with one another? How are we going to produce good, godly families if we are not producing children? Maybe Paul never got around to the story of Adam and Eve. I don't know. Maybe they didn't hear that part. Again, you got to also understand who he's talking to. This Roman Greco society that is not familiar with the law, is not familiar with the gospel. Everything they have, they're getting from Paul. And all they have written down is this letter. And so they're going by Paul's word. They're going by a single letter. Maybe they had some scrolls, I don't know, but they didn't have much. They don't have an entire Bible the way that we have it. So you're going to see where things maybe got taken out of context, or maybe they didn't follow the instruction as it was intended. But there was this particular group that he's talking to that maybe took it a little too far when it came to sexual relations. Relations between a husband and a wife is a gift from God, and Paul knows that, so he takes time to clear the air about his previous statement, being that it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I heard a preacher say one time, he says, sex is kind of like a fire. Depending on where it is depending on what it can do. So if I build a fire in my fireplace, it's good. It's a good thing. If I build a fire in my kitchen, I might burn the house down. So we have to understand that sex in the confines of a loving, heterosexual, monogamous relationship, marriage, is a good thing. But outside of that is quite destructive. And so that's what we need to understand, and that's what he's trying to explain to them when they had such sexual immorality on the left, but absolute abstinence all the way to the right. He says, no, it's somewhere in the middle, and you need to figure that out. Anybody uncomfortable yet? Okay, we're getting there. So this next part is interesting, especially considering where Paul's philosophy of male headship in the household and in the church. He tells them in verses 3 and 4, he says that we have equal responsibilities, husband and wife, to show due affection to our husband or wife. Now, when we talk about headship, it's usually that man has authority in the house, man has authority in the church. Now, here he says when it comes to relations, that we have equal authority over one another. The wife has equal authority over the husband has equal authority over his wife. And so we share this equal responsibility to show those affections to our spouse. And that we should never deprive one another of affection except for mutual consent. I know a lot of ladies say, well, I've got a headache, it ain't happening. The husbands don't normally say that. We don't normally say that. Headache, don't worry about it. We'll make it happen. I'm glad y'all can laugh about that, because I'm up here trying not to blush too hard. But the wife cannot say to the husband that I have decided to abstain from sex, and the husband cannot say likewise. He says that the only purpose for abstaining from relations is for the purpose of prayer and fasting. For any other reason. Now, understand too, he's not saying this as a commandment. He cleared that up for us. This is a concession. This is a good idea to follow, not a command. But he says, if you are going to abstain for a period of time, do it only for the purpose of prayer and fasting. And that's what fasting is. If we fast from food, we are abstaining from eating food. And so it sort of lends itself to fasting, to abstain, if we want to do it for that reason. But we do this. When we fast, we are depriving ourselves of that which we have a strong desire for. I have a strong desire to eat when I get hungry. And likewise, when it comes to relations, I have a strong desire that has to be met. And so, y'all got to stop. But when we fast in addition to our prayers, then what we are saying is that we are relying on God to fill that void of the thing that we are doing without. That is the purpose of prayer and fasting. Paul says only to do this for a time and to come back together quickly because, again, as people, we lack self-control, especially in this area. Let's just be honest. If there's one area that all people can pretty well consent to, we are pretty weak when it comes to this particular area. And he says to come back together quickly because of our lack of self-control so that Satan cannot tempt us and trap us in our weaknesses. I said this a week or two ago that our desires in life determine our destination and how we give into our lack of self-control. Our desires in life and control will possibly destroy us if we are not careful. The desire to have your spouse in an intimate way is one desire that God has given us as a gift. It is a gift, and we shouldn't misuse the gift that God has given us. Because when we misuse that gift, again, the sexually immoral crowd far to the left were misusing the gift that God had given them. And so it could very likely destroy them because sexual sin doesn't just affect you, it affects the one you're with. If I decide I want to deprive myself, I'm not depriving just me, I'm depriving my spouse also. And so that's something you have to consider, that the two become one. We are forever joined to our spouse. And so he says, come back together quickly so that you are not tempted. Let's do some Bible math. When it comes to marriage, 1 plus 1 equals 1. Let's do some more Bible math. 1 plus 1 plus 1 does not equal 1. And so come back together quickly solves that problem. And that's why he says you should not deprive one another except for one purpose, for prayer and for fasting. These instructions that Paul has, on more than one occasion, he clarifies again, this is not a command, but a concession. So I don't want you to take the things that I have just said and says, well, this is an order from headquarters. This is given by God. No, Paul makes it pretty clear. He says, not a command, but probably a good idea if you want to do it this way. And so that's what we need to understand. So you are not being told to abstain from sexual relations with your wife so that you can do prayer and fasting. He's just saying it's a good idea, not a command. But what I can tell you is that when you pray and when you fast, it will make your prayer life more effective if you choose to do it this way. But again, do not do it in such a way where you will find yourself in temptation to do something you ought not do. Because again, we are weak in the flesh. And that's kind of what it boils down to, really, is our weakness in the flesh. We all have a weakness somewhere, and like I said, for men, it's usually here. And there may even be some women who fall in that category. I will not ask questions. But Paul has been given a different gift. Paul does not have a weakness in this part of his life. He says, I wish every man could be just like me, because it don't affect him. Now, I'm glad that's not the giftedness I've been given. But Paul does have this gift, and so there are people out there that they do not have this desire in their life, and that's okay. Paul is saying, he says, don't feel bad if you don't feel like doing that. It's okay. But what he does say, and because he's a realist, he says, if you do have those kinds of desires, then you should probably seek marriage to someone, but be wise about it. I wonder sometimes when we look at some of the issues that we have seen, especially with the clergy and, say, the Roman Catholic Church, these priests and the nuns, they take these vows of celibacy, and if you're not gifted in that way, that's a problem. And we see it manifest itself into sexual abuse cases. And I'm not just picking on Roman Catholics, but the Southern Baptist Convention has had their own problem with this. And they are trying to fix that. But when you take a vow of celibacy and you are not gifted in this way that you you don't have that kind of self-control, it's going to manifest itself in a very, very bad way. And so I don't know that it's a good idea if you lack that self-control to try to do without. God never intended that we be devoted to Him, that we must remain single and never marry and never procreate. Again, that's the instruction God has given us. He said, be fruitful and multiply. Paul addresses those who are unmarried, those who have become widows. He says that if you are not able to abstain, then be celibate. He says you can be celibate, just like me. But if the desire is that deep, then seek a spouse. Not to marry for the sake of being married, because that has its own issues. Don't be getting married just because you're lonely. That's not going to work out. You should find someone that you love enough that when you do marry them, that they are the outlet to express these kinds of desires. So you need to find a godly spouse when you are looking for a spouse. Now, some of us, when I was seeking a spouse, I was not a believer. God showed mercy on me that He gave me a believer, and we'll get to that in a minute about how my wife sanctified me to the point where I found Christ. That's a good thing. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But that's something we need to understand. But just marrying for the sake of marriage can lead to a whole set of problems. And so that's the second thing I want us to look at today is divorce. And let's pick it up here at verse 10. He says, now to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So this is a command, okay? A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now in the Gospels, Jesus tells us that divorce is only permissible if either the husband or wife has broken those marriage vows, has broken that marriage bond by way of adultery. That is the one concession that Jesus has given us when it comes to divorce. Again, the two have become one. You can't undo that. It's not meant to be undone. But there are occasions where we see divorce. Again, 50% divorce rate. And so it's just a sad truth of reality that divorce happens. Paul adds that if you divorce, he says you must remain single. He says because your only option is the one spouse that God gave you. Again, we're talking about believers. I understand that maybe there was a divorce in the past. Y'all weren't believers, or maybe one was a believer and one was not. But just as we talked about the other day, if two believers should always be able to reconcile any disagreement that they have with one another, whether it be in marriage or just friendships in the church. If a believer and a believer disagree, they should be able to just figure it out. And the same goes with two believers in marriage. They should just be able to figure it out. There is nothing too hard for two Christians to be able to settle. And so that's why we see this when it comes to divorce. But again, marriage was intended to be one wife and one husband for a lifetime. So he says your two options. You either remain single, if divorce is all that you can do, or be reconciled to that spouse. Now, he covers the case for widows that you are permitted to remarry if your spouse dies. But if the spouse is alive, that's all you got. That was your one shot that God has given you, if we're talking about believers. Something else to be considered is that the Corinthians had this idea that, say I'm a non-believer, I'm married to a non-believer, Paul has come into town, he's preaching Jesus, I come to Christ, but the spouse ain't on board yet. And so these Corinthians had this idea that my highest allegiance, being to God, which it is that I have to leave this unbeliever. I cannot be unequally yoked. He's got to go, and I'm devoted to God. Paul says, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. He talks about this process of sanctifying your spouse if they are an unbeliever. Now, this is very contrary to Paul's upbringing as a Jew. Now, in the Jewish culture, and if you've read much of the Old Testament, you know that when something clean touches something unclean, they're both unclean. But when we follow Jesus, the way Jesus made a living making things clean that were unclean, sanctifying. And so that's what Paul is telling us to do. He says, if they are willing to stay and make it work, your belief, your faith in Jesus sanctifies your spouse. It sanctifies not only your spouse, but it sanctifies your children and makes them holy. Now, I used to really struggle with this passage because I didn't fully understand sanctification, justification, glorification, all that. And so in my head, I was like, how in the world? I looked at it as salvation. So I was like, how would an unbeliever be saved just because their spouse is saved? And that's not what Paul's saying. Paul is intentionally using this word, sanctifying. And so as we have looked at a few times over the last several weeks, sanctification is that process by which Jesus makes us clean. So what he's saying here is that the clean spouse, the believing spouse, through the work in the home, through the prayer for that spouse who ain't quite there yet, through the witness that they carry in the household, begins to work and to chip away at that hardened heart of that spouse. And so maybe, just maybe, one day they will finally loosen up the reins that they are holding on to and give themselves to Christ, which is what Paul and Jesus really wants us to be working on. So folks, your ministry field doesn't have to be in Cambodia. Your ministry field could be right there in your own home if you have an unbelieving spouse, if you have unbelieving children. You can get a lot of ministry work done right there at the house. But it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. I've told y'all that my own personal process, it didn't happen overnight. It took several years to get me from a statement of faith to when I was ready to get in the pool and get baptized. It takes time for some folks. When me and Megan met, I was not a believer. I wouldn't say I was an unbeliever, but I was one of those who thought because my parents go to church, then I'm probably okay. And as we know, it don't work like that. And so my being with Megan was that sanctifying process that I needed to show me that there is a better way than the way I was doing things. It took me watching her. It took me being around her family. Because, again, my family was, most of my family, I won't say all of my family, most of my family was not a really good example for sanctified living. And so, through that process of seeing her and seeing her family and finally coming to faith in Jesus Christ, that sanctified me, that brought me along. And that's what Paul's talking about. You can't just wipe your hands and be done with them because they don't believe it. You can be that conduit that Jesus needs to get them to where he wants them to be. And so again, consider that your mission field, if that is your situation. the best shot they have to submitting to Christ is through your own personal witness and ministry in the home. You got to consider too, when we go to minister to the lost, we don't wash our hands of the lost, we go to the lost. And so the same thing happens when we're in a marriage with a lost person. We work on them. We show them the better way forward. Paul mentions that not only does our witness affect our spouse, but it affects our children and the way we raise our children in our home. These kids need at least one believing parent in their house. They stand a far better chance with one than they do zero. They stand a greater chance with two. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. It takes Christian parents most times to make Christian children. Is there anyone in here today that your salvation depended on mama and daddy taking you to church? Mom and daddy brought you. Grandma and granddaddy brought you. Somebody in your life brought you to church. Somebody taught you about Jesus and got you to where you are. I would say probably 90% of the time, those of us who are saved because somebody in our family was taking us and praying for us. And so that's what our families need. So he says, don't divorce if you don't have to. Just because you're married to an unbeliever doesn't mean that you need to wash your hands of them. No, you need to work on them. You need to help sanctify them. You need to get them to a place where they can submit themselves to Christ. But what if they just won't stay? And sometimes they just won't stay. I heard a pastor tell me one time, he was giving me advice when I was still very rigid in my biblical understanding of marriage. He says, you can't make them stay. If they want to leave, you can't make them stay. And that's unfortunate. And not to say that we should force someone to stay if they don't want to be there. But if you've reached that point where there's nothing else you can do, you can't make them stay. And so that's what Paul tells us. He says, if they won't stay, let them go. Let them depart. You are no longer under bondage in such cases, is what he says. So what he is essentially giving us is another concession to divorce. Now again, with the understanding that one is a believer, one is not. Because again, if both husband and wife are believers, there's no reason to split up. There's no reason to do that. There's no reason to divorce. But if you are unequally yoked and one is not a believer and you can't convince them to stay, then you just got to let them go. I still firmly believe, again, that two married people who both love Jesus will find a way to stay together. Two believers should be able to handle any disagreement they have and keep a marriage strong. The problem, again, is that not everyone is a believer. Sometimes you get married and neither one of you saved, and maybe only one of you saved. Maybe you thought you could change that person. And in some cases you can. A lot of cases you can't. And so this kind of leads me to the next section. And right on the top here, it kind of looks like it's out of place, but when you consider the context of what he's talking about and consider the context of what comes after, I think it fits pretty well. But let's pick it up here in verse 17, and we'll look at sort of our lot in life. Where do we find ourselves? Verse 17, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price, and do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now, I'm sure Paul had preached to them that we are each one a new creation in Christ. And so the Corinthians probably took this quite literally, because some of the things that the Bible historians tell us was taking place in this church was that, again, I'm a new creation, so everything starts over. I'm going to be brand new, so maybe I'm not a virgin well, I'm not a virgin, I can become one again. Or maybe I've been circumcised and I can somehow undo that. They thought they could undo that. I'm not sure how you do that, but anyway. But what the idea was that they were in a Greek society, and most Greeks were not circumcised. And so you had the Jews that had migrated there, and they were thinking they could undo it to fit into society. Likewise, the Greeks said, at maybe the ripe old age of 30 or 40 or however old they were, they've come to Christ. Well, I've got to get circumcised. And Paul's like, you don't have to. I wouldn't recommend it. He said, just be happy where you're at. Be happy with the state of life that you're already in. He says, if you're a slave, just be happy being a slave. And that seems pretty extreme. And probably, especially when you read like Philemon or something like that, the idea is I've come to Christ. I'm going to be freed now. I don't have to be a slave no more. And he says, not always the case. Be happy where you're at. Be happy with your lot in life that God has given you. Be happy with the cards you've been dealt. Because God has ordained that for you in your life. A lot of people, I could probably spend an entire sermon on just this. Being happy where you are in life. Because most people are not. Most Christians are not. We always want more, better, bigger, best, right? That's kind of how we are, most of us. And so just because I've come to Jesus doesn't mean I'm going to become a millionaire. Just because I've come to Jesus don't mean I'm going to be super athletically gifted. Not everyone in the church is called to be a preacher or a teacher, but God has ordained specific roles in our lives for our lives. And such is the same for our marriages. And I think this is how this ties in. Because for some, your lot in life is that you may never get married. You may never know the affections of a husband or of a wife. That might not be what God has in store for you. So he says here to remain as you are. Verse 25. Now concerning virgins, he says, I have no command from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he might please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, Not that I put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes, he does not sin. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to marry to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. There's a lot there of what he just covered, but one of the things that I want you to notice is that not everybody's meant to get married. I know we are often told, every one of us, that God has that special someone out there waiting for you. And that, unfortunately, is not the case for everybody. Paul begins by saying this, again, not a command from God, but really good advice. Maybe you should listen. He does carry some authority as an apostle, so he is qualified to give such advice. Obviously, God doesn't keep time the same way we keep time. And so the current distress that he spoke of is, again, Paul has preached that Jesus is coming back and he's coming back soon. And so that current distress is what some of these folks were upset about. They're like, well, Jesus is going to come back and I've never been able to be married and I've never been able to consummate said marriage. That's something people look forward to. And so these people were going around and just trying to get married to whomever for whatever reason, and just so they could have a good time. Again, I can't blame them. I wouldn't want to miss out on that either. But again, God doesn't keep time the way we keep time. And as we know now, this side of the cross, we are 2,000 years removed from what Paul has instructed here. So obviously, Jesus didn't come back in their lifetime. It would be a bad thing to marry a person just for the sake of being married. And then to come find out again, Jesus didn't come back. Not when you thought he would. I'll give you a little personal story. I know my wife already hates this story, but I feel like it lends itself to this message. So I had a girlfriend, not a girlfriend, but a girlfriend. She was my friend, and that's it. But at a certain stage in my life, before I met my wife, I was having a hard time finding a girlfriend, and she was having a hard time finding a boyfriend. And we had jokingly come up with this pact that, hey, I guess if neither one of us gets married by the time we're 30, we'll just get married to each other. Again, because we didn't want to be lonely. And that was what it all boiled down to. We really didn't like each other like that, but we just didn't want to be lonely. We knew we liked each other enough to be friends, so instead of being lonely, if we make it to 30 and we ain't been married yet, me and you will just get married. We'll just get hitched and have a good time. The crazy thing to think about it now is being 19 or 20 years old and thinking you might never find a wife. You might never find a husband. That's a very young age. Now, looking back at it now, we should not have been nearly as concerned at 19 and 20 years old about trying to find the person that I'm going to be supposed to be married to for the rest of my life. Now, what I can tell you is I am glad that pact never went through for multiple reasons. for a lot of reasons. First of all, being my lovely wife sitting right here. But knowing what I know now, knowing that what she had gone through in the latter years, the direction that my life has taken in the latter years, and me and her, we went two opposite directions from that point. That would not have been a happy marriage. That would not have been a godly marriage. And it most likely would have ended in divorce because we decided we didn't want to be lonely. And so what I'm telling you is that there might not be that person out there for you. Not everyone will, but maybe that person's out there. It just takes a little bit more time. Maybe you let God handle that. And that's part of what he's addressing here, is that instead of spending your time looking for a wife, why don't you spend your time working for the Lord? Now, granted, I was not worried about working for the Lord at this point in my life either. But I did reach a point where I was less concerned about finding a mate, finding a wife. I finally had said, you know what, the heck with it. I ain't messing with these girls no more. If the good Lord wants me to have a wife, he'll find me one, and I'll just deal with it then. He had one right under my nose the whole time, and I didn't even know it until she about ran into my pickup truck in the parking lot at NC State. That's one way to find one if you're looking for one. But God did have someone picked out specifically for me. I firmly believe that. And again, I tell you that because that is why I believe so strongly about marriage, because me and her's never always gotten along all the time perfect. We don't always get along all the time perfect, but guess what? We're both believers and we figure it out. We don't decide to just stay mad and carry each other to court and get divorced, and then we're fighting over custody with the kids, this, that, and the other. I told her, I said, if you leave me, I'm just going to be a hermit in the woods somewhere. You ain't going to find me. I say that jokingly because, again, we know divorce is not an option. We've never allowed it to be an option. When we disagree, we just say, we will figure it out. There is not an argument too big for me and for Megan, because what we have is much bigger than any argument. And so we stick with that. Again, Paul tells us that marriage is hard and full of troubles. So if it's going to be hard, if it's going to be full of trouble, you had better do it with someone who you have given your whole heart to. All the love you have, give to that person, because if you don't love them enough, then you'll just get up and you'll leave. And so he says, I tell you this to spare you from this. Because again, the problem was people just getting married for the sake of being married. No one wants to be alone. Paul says it's okay to just not be married. He's not saying marriage is a bad thing, but he's not saying that being single is bad either. He says there's a lot of good that comes with being single. Again, just be content with life where you are. And sometimes we just have to do that. Just be content with life where we are. Another thing that was happening, again, because of the current distress, Jesus is coming back any day now, is we had those who were engaged to be married. Now, in this current culture, there was like a 1-year betrothal engagement process where they were essentially married, but they have not yet consummated the marriage. Pledged to be married, but had to wait 1 year to consummate the marriage. And so if you're sitting here thinking, well, I've got the one I want, she's right there, and Jesus come back tomorrow, I want to go ahead and get this thing going. They were starting, the men, I'm sure, were getting a little bit antsy. So Paul says, look, if you can't go without and you've already betrothed, just go ahead and get married. It's better to be married than to sin. I heard a preacher say this one time about him and his wife when they were very young and engaged to be married. He says that they had to move the wedding date up a little bit sooner because their biology was about to override their theology. So it's time, you get to that point. So you just got to kind of move things along. You know who you're going to marry. There's no reason for long engagements. If you know you want to be married to someone, if you know you love that person enough to be married to them, sometimes the best thing is just go ahead and just be married. I ain't talking about married in the eyes of the Lord. I'm talking about actual marriage. I hear that term a lot. Well, we're married in the eyes of the Lord. That's a real nice way of saying that we're living in sin. That's a whole other topic. But Paul is saying that each of us needs to discern our own giftedness as it pertains to our marriages and our marital relations. If you can't do without, then find someone you love and enjoy marriage to the fullest. But maybe marriage just isn't for you. In that case, he says, devote your time and your energy to the Lord. Again, because part of my duty as a husband, he mentions this, is that I'm not always concerned with the things of the Lord. I am concerned with the world because, again, it takes being concerned with the Lord, with the world, to be able to provide for my wife. Now, luckily, my providing for my wife has to do with ministry work in the church, and I thank you all for that. But most everyone in here has a secular job. That is you being concerned with the world. And how am I going to provide for my wife? How am I going to provide for my husband? How am I going to provide for my kids? That is you being concerned with the world. And he says it's a good thing if you don't have this concern. That you can just be single. You can just do the work of the Lord. Devote your energy to fulfilling the gospel mission if marriage isn't for you. And he finishes up by addressing the widows. He says, if your husband is taken away from you by the Lord, usually a lot sooner than you think they ought to, he says it's okay to marry again to a believer. So widows, if you want to be married again, if you feel like the Lord has led you into that, make sure if you're going to find another spouse, you're finding one who loves Jesus just as much as you do. Paul again says this is an opinion, not a command, but also that widows should maybe consider being single. Because again, the idea is one man, one wife for a lifetime. If your one and only has gone to be with the Lord, then you are free to do what you wish at being married or unmarried. If you have experienced all the love and intimacy that you care to have in your one lifetime and work solely for the Lord, that's what he says you should do. And so I hope this message, I know there was a lot there, and I hope it didn't sound too crude. Believe me, I have worked all week trying to make this thing not seem crude or like toilet humor or anything like that. And that's why I also considered maybe we let the kids have a break today, because this can precipitate a lot of questions some of y'all probably just don't want to answer this week. Because I'm sure you would get plenty of them by the time you got back in the car to go get something to eat. But again, what I want you to consider that marriage and keeping marriage holy is something that is so, so important to me. And it should be for each and every one of you. But also consider if marriage just ain't the thing that works for you, that's okay too. People shouldn't feel any pressure to just be married for the sake of being married. I understand that none of us want to be alone. None of us like being lonely. But sometimes that's just where God needs you to be. And we should just be content with that. We should be content in good times and in bad times. We should be content if our house is full and if our house is empty. We should just be content that we have a Jesus that loves us. Amen? Would you stand, please?